This is Conspirinormal.
Welcome to Conspirinormal, everybody. We are back, and Sergio is with me remotely.
Continuing with the quarantine series of Conspirinormal episodes.
Yes, and we have a special guest on the line, and that is someone that we had on a couple of years ago that we talked about, I believe about the Knights of Malta. Was that?
Yeah.
I think that's what we talked about. Yeah.
Yes, that was correct.
And we've got Stephen Snider, who also goes by the nom de guerre or nom de plume, Recluse. Welcome back to Conspirinormal.
Well, thanks for having me back, guys.
Yeah. Thanks for coming back. So you have a new book that is it out yet, or is it still to come out?
It's out now, both in a digital version and physical copy on Amazon.
Okay. And it is called Strange Tales of the ParaPolitical. And this is a great book. It's like a collection of essays, but the essays really kind of cross-pollinate each other. And basically it's this kind of like deep dive exploration from the end of World War II on about the right wing and private military companies, all of the stuff that we're going to get into. But Recluse, I kind of wanted to get your take on what you mean by parapolitical.
Well, that's a good point. I was just discussing this with my research assistant literally just yesterday. It was a kind of a point that he wanted to get into in the next podcast. I'm dealing with him in about 2 weeks. But, essentially, to kind of distinguish parapolitics from conspiracy theories, I mean, you go back to kind of the archetypal, parapolitical researchers like Peter Dale Scott or Jeffrey Bale or somebody like that. But I mean, essentially, it's an attempt to investigate, I guess, what we would now refer to as deep politics, but I mean from an actually scholarly perspective with lots of footnotes, citation, and even, to some extent, something that I'm trying to get into now, actual research that goes into personal archives and that type of thing, and even interviews with the subjects and whatnot. I mean, this is, typically a lot different than like behold a pale horse or something like that, where I mean the citations are few and far between, and you're mostly just throwing out other conspiracy books. I try to look to legitimate scholarly sources, for my citations and that type of thing. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I would say, a higher grade of research than what you would normally get with a lot of conspiratorial research in this regard.
Okay. And it's kind of like, what was the purpose of writing this book? What kind of like led you to start to write this particular book?
Well, it was actually pitched to me by Frank Zero, my co-host on the farm. He had actually sent me the ideal for it while I was on my honeymoon in Washington, D.C., kind of amidst the Scottish Rite, headquarters in D.C. and the International Spy Museum. But yeah, he basically wanted to do something that was centered around how trauma is used to manipulate society, essentially. That was, I think, an early title for the book, Trauma-Based Society, or something to that effect. And specifically kind of looking at it through the prism of Naomi Klein's concept of the Shock Doctrine, which she, has essentially tried to argue was a combination of techniques that had been invented by MK Ultra, and specifically the psychic driving experiments of Ewan Cameron, and fused with Chicago-style economics of Milton Friedman. And this had kind of provided a potent blend to reorient societies. The first, in her perception, the first fully formed rollout of it, if you will, was in Chile in 1973, when they had the coup d'etat that brought Pinochet to power. And from there was an attempt to essentially radically reorient society in the aftermath of just this tremendous trauma that they had undergone with the military coup and that type of thing. And that was a very fascinating concept to me. And, I started started to look around at just, other instances of this. Of course, since already, with Chile on the mind, I mean, you kind of go to, at least, I do anyway, to Colonia Dignidad, and I thought that
Sure.
that would be, kind of a compelling way to emphasize, another aspect of how trauma had been employed in Chile, and then from there, kind of looking at some of the things that the Mellon family had been into, and also the private military industry.
So you start with the Mellon family, and their influence, and kind of like their involvement in things like the Profumo Affair, and also some other kind of like skullduggery like that, kind of like honeypot rings and all this kind of stuff. So kind of go into that, because the Mellon family, I know that our good friend Dr. Future, who you spoke to last time on the show, he has kind of gone down this similar road with the Mellon family, and how like influential they are in like these really like radically right-wing circles.
Yeah, no, they're quite fascinating. Obviously, they don't get a lot of the press that some of the other storied American dynasties like the Rockefeller and Morgan families and the Rothschilds and that type of thing get, which is a real pity. I would probably argue at this point in time they maintain much more influence than the Morgan family, and most likely the Rockefeller family as well. But they, of course, had their origins in Pittsburgh. The patriarch was Judge Thomas Mellon, who had set up the Mellon Bank towards the end of the Civil War. And by 1900, it had become the largest financial institution outside of New York, and that had really provided a stepping stone for the family to branch out into a host of other industries. Probably the other big one was Gulf Oil, which got them, into the petroleum industry just as it was really starting to blow up in the early 20th century. And certainly the most famous Mellon from this era would have been Andrew Mellon, the long-serving Secretary of Treasury. He was there from, I believe, when Harding went in 1920 up to 1932 when Hoover departed. So he oversaw the Roaring '20s and the stock market crash of 1929. Obviously, there's a lot of dispute. There has been for years among economists and so forth as to how much blame or credit he deserves for these two events. But another significant factor would happen about a decade later, and that would be the onset of the Second World War, and also, the first attempt to really create a coordinated Central Intelligence Group for the United States. This was, of course, the Office of Strategic Services, and a lot of elite families were major parts of this, and the Mellons were no exception. Quite a few of the both direct family members and their in-laws had ended up serving in the OSS. And two of the guys who we specifically look at in this essay, Richard Mellon Scafee, his father had been an OSS guy. William Mellon Hitchcock, I'm not sure. I don't actually think that his dad had been in the OSS, but certainly he had ended up rubbing some elbows eventually with several other in-laws who had. So certainly the intelligence ties that the family had possessed really from the beginning of the modern American intelligence community were substantial, and it seems like this relationship has continued well into the 21st century.
So what is their involvement in things like the Profumo Affair?
Well, that plays into William Mellon Hitchcock, or Mr. Billy, as the help referred to him as. He's just, a really fascinating figure, really, just for all the stuff that he got involved in the 1960s. But with Profumo, he was living in the UK in London with a private detective called Thomas Corbally, who's also really one of the true enigmas of the 20th century. But these guys were, sharing a flat together, throwing orgies out of it. They got to know a society osteopath called Stephen Ward, who was really the guy who was running this upscale ring that provided women for these VIPs, these aristocrats, and so on and so forth. He ran into a little trouble when one of the girls that he was running, Christine Keeler, had an affair with a Russian, or today at this point in time, a Soviet naval attaché who was actually a member of the GRU, the principal Soviet military intelligence service, which had been deliberate. Unfortunately, afterwards, she started having an affair with John Profumo, the the time, I believe it was the Secretary for Defense or something to that effect in the UK. Very prominent cabinet official, and there's been a lot of dispute by historians whether this was intended or not, but it did create some significant issues for the government of Harold Macmillan down the road, and that was where Mr. Billy stepped in along with Corbally. They essentially seemed like they were tapped by David Bruce, who was another Mellon family in-law, to look into this whole fiasco to see what exactly was going on with Ward. Of course, he had become very close to this the Soviet GRU guy. The British, I should say, were effectively using him as a back channel during the Cuban Missile Crisis to communicate with the Soviet Union. So there was a lot of just crazy stuff going on with Ward, and this was very concerning to the Americans for a lot of reasons. Least of all, though, probably because there was some question of his loyalties, and probably more significantly, whether or not this would trace back to the pedophile rings in the UK that really were exposed with Jimmy Savile of late. Certainly, there were elements of this kind of hovering in the background of Ward's ring. I mean, most of the girls that he used were close to legal age, usually 16, 17, 18, but he did certainly deliberately recruit women, or I should really say girls at that point.
Kind of like the Jeffrey Epstein of his time. Huh?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the girls that he recruited specifically were ones that were supposed to look even younger. So, I mean, you're talking women or girls that were 17, 18 who, could pass for being 14 or 15 for, these lords and so forth. They were being used to service.
Wow.
So things like that really show, I guess, gave people a glimpse into this kind of public-private partnership that goes back to the beginning of our modern intelligence apparatus that you show, where a lot of these elite families and people from this upper class are really from the get-go, along with private corporations and early forms of private intelligence companies in the very beginning of especially the Anglo American intelligence establishment. Like you really show that from the start, it's been this revolving door.
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely, and that's really something I'm going to get into even more with the next book I'm working on, which is actually kind of tracking the history of these sex rings with that eventually showed up with Epstein. But yeah, I mean really, the U.S. intelligence community really grew out of these kind of interwar gentlemen clubs network, the Travelers Club, the End of the World Club. There was one in New York City that was very exclusive, that was simply known as the Room, and it was just this kind of cabal of these very prominent Eastern establishment figures on the one hand, with their counterparts in the UK, some British spooks mixed in, and so on and so forth. And this was the network really that Sir William Stevenson, who was essentially the guy who really created our intelligence community, if you really want to get down to it. This is what he tapped into when he was, helping Donovan set up the Office of Strategic Services. So, yeah, I mean, it just really from the get-go, this kind of emerged out of a private, network really of gentlemen's clubs and old boy networks and so on and so forth. It went in directly into the government during the Second World War. And then aspects of it in the aftermath kind of continued both in a public and private nature, depending upon what was more expedient.
So in that aftermath of the Second World War, the Second World War itself really, catapults these agencies to prominence in our countries. But then also after the Second World War, this influx of, former Nazis and fascists really has a tremendous impact in shaping the Cold War, and you really explore that. And I mean, we've all heard of Project Paperclip and the Nazis in the rocket program, of course we had, and even, the mythos of Nazis hiding out in South America. But I think until you really see all these people and their relationships put together and put on paper like you've done in what you call the Black Orchestra and the Special Operations Mafia, I mean, it really, it's not like some, isolated couple guys here and there. Like we had this very close relationship to all these guys, and so many of these people survived and prospered and did terrible things around the whole world and shaped the whole Cold War, and you really get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, well, that was, I think that was the first thing my wife essentially said to me when she finished reading, that Colonia Dignidad essay, was something to the effect of like, wow, I really can't believe how many Nazis we used after the Second World War, or something like that. But, yeah, no, that was really kind of, though, what I was, pushing for, just, yeah, I mean, to really just, definitively illustrate just how extensive all of this was. And of course, I mean, we're told the kind of public consumption stuff with paperclip, and it was mostly just these, these scientists and what have you that we were using. But I mean, when you really look at the stay behind armies that were set up in the aftermath, Gladio and that type of thing, I mean, it wasn't just scientists. I mean, there were just really hardened, Nazis, SS men, their equivalent in Italy, the Quislings and so forth from Eastern Europe, the collaborators from France. All of these guys were just, employed extensively in these stay behind armies, which, had just, I think, disastrous results for Western Europe throughout the Cold War on many number of levels.
What is what you call the Black Orchestra?
Well, I mean, it was essentially this network, this, I guess originally it began really as an SS underground, if you will, with the central figure being Odo Scherzini, Hitler's favorite commando, Scarface, the guy who had rescued Mussolini with a detachment of commandos using hand gliders, that type of thing. But I mean, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, initially this was geared more to just self-preservation, really. I mean, these guys were, wanted for war crimes by the Soviets and the US, the British. They were just really trying to get out of Dodge and hide out. But I mean, certainly you had these resources, this money, and this network that spread out. And as the years went on, it wasn't just former Nazis. Of course, after the rebellion of the secret army organization in France against de Gaulle, you had all of these OAS veterans who went into the ranks beginning in the early 60s. By the middle of the 60s to the late 60s, you started having all of these Italian neo-fascists that were going into the ranks. Of course, you had all the aid from Franco's Spain and so forth. And even to some extent, especially reactionary Catholic orders. Of course, the Knights of Malta, which we've already talked about. Opus Dei was another one. But I mean, by the early 70s, it really had become a full-blown orchestra with an international reach, not just in Europe, but spread across South America, the Middle East, and it had these these just large, spanning influences that had come into it over the years from the French, from the Nazis, from the Italians, and, strangely, even the kind of mystical beliefs that filtered into it too from individuals like Julius Evola and what have you. So yeah, it was quite a big deal, really throughout the 70s, 80s, until some of these guys finally started to die off. But the legacy is certainly still with us, for better or worse.
Yeah, that underbelly of the Cold War and all the friends we made and temporary friends we made during it. I don't think, I mean, many people don't really come to terms with that. But, you really show the connections between, you got the characters, you've got the organizations and think tanks, and then you have the intelligence agencies and private intelligence agencies and mercenaries, and you kind of you show all these webs between them. And I think I've never really seen it all put together like that. I think you do a really good job, and I really recommend checking out the book.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that before we kind of get into that, because that is a very important part of this, probably like the most important part of this. But let's talk about Colonia Dignidad and the weird connections that come around Colonia Dignidad, and also kind of like the importance of the Chilean coup of 1973 and what that really means to something like Operation Gladio, and how this was almost like a kind of a culmination of, and almost like a goal was reached with the Chilean coup in a way by these groups.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, certainly it was one of just the most effective coup d'état that these groups and the U.S. had, ever sponsored. And I mean, one of the things that was especially striking to me, going not just through, all the things that were happening in Chile at this time, but the Southern Cone countries, Argentina, Paraguay, that also had these, strong fascist networks present in them. But with Chile, it was just the coup. The biggest thing about it was just how bloodless it really was. You look conversely at, say, Argentina. You had years where the death squads there would kill, upwards to 10,000 people or something like that. I mean, I think the total number of people killed during the so-called Dirty War there was probably, between 30 and 50,000 people or something to that effect. Whereas Chile, I mean, Pinochet was in power for roughly 20 years or so. He still, effectively headed the armed forces, I believe, until the mid to late 90s. But in that entire time, there were only roughly, some 3,000 or so political prisoners that were murdered under his regime. And, that's tragic. I'm not trying to dismiss that in any way, shape, or form. But
Sure.
Certainly the death toll was not anywhere near what you saw in Argentina and some of the neighboring countries. And I just think a lot of that had to do with just how scientific, in a sense, it was, or methodical, if you will. Of course, the coup was so abrupt and sudden; it was able to completely decapitate the Allendean forces rather thoroughly, and then you had kind of the mass, almost psychodrama in the immediate aftermath, with people being relocated to the National Football Stadium and just all of the weird stuff that was going on there, and then the I guess kind of tour around the country where they rounded up dissidents and killed them. And but then from there, it just really, it dies down. It was such a thorough decapitation of the current government, and just the absolute trauma and the propaganda that they were able to generate from it was so thorough. It just numbed the populace. And then, you kind of reinforce this with places like Colonia Dignidad, these just shadowy, sinister, containment or compounds that you could disappear people to. So, I mean, it's really just fascinating in that sense how it was managed like that. And certainly there were a lot of different influences that were at play there. You had, of course, all of the French theorists, the Guerre Revolutionary guys, of course, the French military officers who had developed this ideology in the Algerian War, had actually trained the Chilean military forces. You had these Italian neo-fascists who brought the strategy of tension doctrine, which had all played into Gladio and what have you. So yes, I mean, it really was accumulation of all this, and then just methods that the U.S. intelligence community had already, used in Indonesia, kind of an early coup in that kind of mold as well.
Indonesia was horrible. Like
Yeah.
1 million people were killed.
And that was, I mean, that, like I said, that was kind of the thing. You sort of look at what went on with Suroto or something in Indonesia. I mean, it's, I think it was actually like 500,000, but it was still a lot of bloody people that were killed there, compared to what Pinochet was able to manage in Chile. So, I mean, it was just really, it's certainly a fascinating example of this and just how brutally efficient it was ultimately.
Yeah, in Argentina, the Dirty War was much more over like an extended period of time. I believe like about 6 years, I think, if memory serves correctly.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was kind of another thing. I mean, you had the coup, which ironically was launched in September 11th, 1973. And I think they had really consolidated control over most of the country before, the year was even out, and there just wasn't, a major resistance that built up against what was going on there, like you saw in Argentina, which essentially prolonged the Dirty War there for years.
Well, Schaefer, who was the cult leader that was the head of Colonia Dignidad, he had a lot of strange connections as well. There was a lot of I think that a lot of this kind of like just this neo-Nazi and really hardcore right-wing Operation Gladio network really had kind of propped him up.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely is what it seems like. I mean, of course, the colony had eventually became a major operational center for what became known as Operation Condor, which was it was essentially an arrangement that the various intelligence services in the Southern Cone had come to, and effectively, if you were fighting a rebel group that fled from your country into another country, you could go out there and grab them, take them back, torture them, or you could rely on another neighboring friendly intelligence service to do it for you. So it really became, a kind of transnational death squad, if you will. And the colony was really a central hub for that. And I mean, you saw a lot of guys, some of these neo-fascist terrorists and so forth, who had been involved in, Gladio and the strategy of tension in Italy. And they had fled, for various reasons, chiefly legal reasons, during the early to mid 70s. Many of them relocated to South America. They set up shop there, and I mean, they were kind of plugged into all this stuff that was going on with Operation Condor, and that kind of provided a nexus too for it to become more ambitious after a time. They had the assassinations that they eventually tried in Italy, which failed ultimately, and then of course the famous one in Embassy Row in the United States in D.C., which was successful and was actually somewhat detrimental because of that. But so just there alone with the colony, you had this just nexus of people plugged into this, just kind of international terror network. And then, of course, there were the ties as well to Le Cercle, which, are just thoroughly disturbing. I've already gone into this somewhat in my blog, but, lawyers associated with Le Cercle had effectively been providing the colony with legal assistance during the 1980s when some of the outrages that were being committed there started to come to the attention of the international community. But in my research in this, I was able to figure out that actually one of the founders of Le Cercle had been a very prominent supporter of the colony, and that's really significant in terms of some of the extracurricular activities, shall we say, that Herr Schaefer was involved with, namely the sexual abuse of children, which he was quite prolific at. Yes, and it was very tragic and very disgusting, and sadly, it was about par of the course with Le Cercle. Of course, if you've read any of my accounts of it on my blog, it's been linked quite extensively to the Dutroux affair in Belgium, and just the whole rings of pedophiles that were exposed with that from this one particular serial killer, and also from many of the British members as well, the rings that were eventually exposed with Jimmy Savile. And then of course you had William Casey, who was a prominent American backer of Le Cercle, and of course all of his ties to the Franklin scandal in the United States. So certainly a lot of times when people ask me, is there some kind of coordinating body for these sex rings and what have you, I often point to Le Cercle. I mean, that's really, I think, the closest thing that we've been able to uncover is some kind of potential international body that was overseeing these different operations. I mean, you can certainly see the presence in Chile with the colony, in the United States with Franklin, and then Dutroux, and the things with Savile in the UK.
So Le Cercle, that translates to the circle, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what were they? What was their primary? What was it? They were kind of like they were more of a French kind of like I guess you describe it in the book as the kind of right-wing version of the Bilderbergers.
Yes, essentially. Of course, they had actually begun as a bit of an offshoot of the Bilderberg group, essentially trying to help with French and German rapprochement in the aftermath of the Second World War. And in the early years, it was more of a French thing with a lot of involvement from the Germans. But I think first and foremost, though, it was really a reactionary Catholic group. Pretty much every founding member had either been involved with the Knights of Malta or Opus Dei, or in some cases both. So there was definitely a very pronounced Catholic characteristic to it. And I kind of think in that sense, initially it was meant as a bit of a counterbalance to the Anglo-American Protestant dominated Bilderberg group. Le Cercle was essentially meant to be more representative of Catholic continental Europe. But certainly its characteristics did begin to change somewhat in the 1970s, and that was when you had a massive influx of British Tories into the group, really personified by Lord Julian Amery. And that domination has really continued up to the present day. I mean, I think every chairman of Le Cercle since the early 80s has been British, if I'm not mistaken.
So you had a lot of these groups forming post-World War II, very anti-communist. But in 1965, there's a conference that you really stress really came up with an ideology for how to radically combat communism in ways that we would think, would be morally reprehensible or, totally outside of what the rules of warfare are supposed to be. So can you go into that, what this conference was and what really developed from that?
Oh yeah. Well, it was I can't remember. It was like the Principe. I can't remember the name of the hotel off the top of my head, but it was a 2 or 3 day conference that the Italian military had sponsored in part, and effectively this was where the concept of the strategy of tension was developed, which would really become kind of a modus operandi for many neo-fascist groups in Europe going into the late 60s and beyond. But essentially, it's argued that in order to return fascism essentially to power, it would require acts of terrorism committed by both the left and the right. And this would eventually destabilize national governments to the point that there would be a call for a military coup d'etat, and this was seen as a favorable climate for fascism to return. To this end, many of the participants, on the one hand, sought to infiltrate the military and the security services so that there would be, ample fellow travelers when this alleged coup d'etat happened, and then on the other hand, to also heavily infiltrate left-wing organizations as well, because, again, it was crucial that terrorism was coming from both the left and the right, but certainly, they wanted to really play up the threat of communist terrorism. So, a lot of times they would attempt to infiltrate revolutionary leftist groups, and in some cases they even just, outright try to invent groups altogether if they couldn't, find ones that were suitably militant enough. So yes, it was a very, just horrific strategy, and it really underpinned the so-called years of lead, which gripped Italy in the 70s and 80s. Just a wave of terrorism that had just a traumatic effect on the country during that time frame.
And so one of the main ideas, I guess, was that World War III had already effectively begun, but it would be asymmetrical, and it would use what then the French called revolutionary warfare.
Yes, that is correct. Le guerre révolutionnaire. That was a concept that they had really started to come up with during the French Indochina War. And basically, it was based off of the guerrilla warfare tactics of Mao Zedong combined with the French experiences in the Indochina War. And more or less, they concluded that the only way that they could win this, alleged Third World War against the communists is that they had to completely adopt the methods of the communists and become even more brutal than the communists. The first real attempt to play this out was in Algeria by the French, which I had alluded to before, and their attempt to, conquer populations and rather than strategic territories and that type of thing. Yes, a popular method of conquering the population was to abduct individuals, from the streets of Algeria or whatever, believed to be spies for the insurgency. They would be horrendously tortured for roughly 24 hours. This was the time frame in which it was believed that whatever useful intelligence they had would no longer be useful if they had passed that time frame. So, yeah, they would experience things like the water pipe method, which we now know as waterboarding. And then after the 24 hours had passed, they would commit suicide. And this was managed by flying them out into the Mediterranean in a helicopter and throwing them into the sea. The thinking being that, then the mangled bodies would wash up on shore, and this would have a further devastating impact on the populace and their loved ones. That was how they were going to conquer the population.
And some of these are older Gladio ideas too, because that stay behind idea being within, but also the threats being from, Gladio was officially, if the Soviet Union invades Western Europe, then these will be like these guerrilla operations to work against it. But then also they were focused on the internal threat, which is actually the internal politics. So they effectively became like domestic terrorist organizations in these countries as well, against the left wing or progressive governments.
Well, I mean, even against just, the, establishments essentially of many of the continental, European countries, because, I mean, again, the Gladio stuff was pretty much totally devised by the US and UK, and it had been based upon Operation Jedburgh, which was an operation that was run by the Office of Strategic Services and the Special Operations Executive during the Second World War. And these were basically the stay-behind networks at the time that were deployed in France and so on and so forth to wage a guerrilla war against the Nazis when the Allied invasion began. So, basically they're being hit in the front by an actual army, and then they're being hit in the rear by these guerrilla groups, going around assassinating people and blowing up armaments and
It's
that
like
type of thing.
Fifth column kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. But, and that was the theory, we would set this up in the event that the Soviet Union had an invasion. But it just so happens, all of these, Nazis and mafia figures that we recruited into these stay-behind networks were, perfect to also destabilize France and Italy and any other Western European quote-unquote ally that threatened to become too independent of the consensus of the Anglo-American community.
And then, on the other hand, you had something called Operation Bloodstone, which was for behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah. I mean, again, a lot of these guys, especially a lot of the, the Quislings, the Ukrainians, and all these other Eastern European groups that were, evacuated after the communists had defeated the national governments in Eastern Europe and so on and so forth. So these guys were then recruited by the US and the UK to be sent back into their, their home countries so that they could form some kind of, stay-behind network there that they could use to gradually destabilize the Soviet forces and then eventually retake the countries, or at least that was the theory. But there's just, I mean, for one thing, the guy the British had overseeing all this was Kim Philby, who was, of course, the notorious Soviet double agent. And the more I've looked at this, a lot of this research has gone into the Epstein book, I'm pretty convinced the British were firmly aware that he was a double agent by this point in time. And then on top of that, I mean, all of these expat groups, the Ukrainians, the Albanians, the Latvians, and so on and so forth, they were all firmly infiltrated by Soviet intelligence. So, yeah, I mean, I think in some senses, they had initially thought there might have been a good ideal to this, but after realizing whatever guys you could have sent in there were just totally riddled by communists, and we've still got these groups on the payroll, and they're working with our own security services, well, let's just send them off into Eastern Europe. The guys who are already working with the Soviets will be, reunited with their employers, and those who aren't will be killed. And, that'll, wash our hands of this problem, so to speak. So, yeah, I mean, it was really brutal in a lot of senses. But, yeah, I think that it kind of almost became a convenient way to basically retire assets of a dubious loyalty, essentially.
So really, they have a lot of adventurism, of course, from the Second World War on. But you talk about how post-Watergate, America had such a gutting of our intelligence agencies, of people who might have been involved in all this stuff with these types of characters beforehand. And that really ramping up the private side of this, and also just having all these veteran intelligence people that didn't have jobs anymore, kind of made them all created like a mass exodus into this underground world. And then, of course, we get the heating up of the Cold War in the 80s, and this was kind of like the prime time for all that.
Yeah, it was really the catalyst when Reagan, came to power, and really Bill Casey became the director of the CIA. Of course, I mean, he was an OSS veteran. I mean, he had been there, at the beginning of this kind of public-private merger, and he really wanted to get, things back to the good old days when the OSS and later the CIA could just kind of carry out these covert operations with impunity. And, they had always used a certain amount of off the book assets for plausible deniability and so forth, but I mean, at least some of this was kept under, you actually had actual CIA officers working with these guys and that type of thing. Whereas, after the Watergate scandal and the stuff that came out with MK Ultra and what have you, it just pushed this kind of stuff further and further into what I and a lot of other researchers like to refer to as the deep private. Is just a way, of further increasing the plausible deniability and, putting more and more degrees of legal separation as well between you and the operations.
And what were some of those things in the 80s that occurred? I mean, most people are pretty familiar with what happened in Central America, but I mean, what kind of operations in particular did this lead to?
Well, in the case of like Nicaragua, for instance, we actually used a British private military company, Kini Mini Services, to actually carry out a lot of the training and so forth of the troops there. And of course, there's also long been allegations that they did more than train, that they were actually being used to prop up some of these quote unquote freedom fighters as well. And that was really kind of, par of the course with how the British had done this type of thing for years. They were really the architects of the modern private military industry. But, besides Kini Mini, I mean, Wackenhut was another one that we were using for intelligence purposes and what have you there. Wackenhut, of course, the infamous private detective agency, has been, it does a host of different stuff. I mean, it has security guards for rest stops in Florida. It did for many years guard Area 51.
That's That's the one that I believe Ken Thomas wrote about in The Octopus.
Yeah.
And Danny Casolaro and all that.
Yeah. Well, they also had been, involved in that whole with the Indian reservation too, and
the Cabazon Indian reservation.
Yeah, and just the weapons trafficking that had been going on there and what have you. So I mean, it definitely seems like you started to see more of these really corporate entities as well that were being brought in to handle this drug and arms trafficking and what have you. And this was stuff maybe in the past that they would have probably used off the book sources for in general, because I mean, obviously, you don't want acknowledged CIA officers caught, trying to sell cocaine or something like that. It's a little embarrassing, but but now, I mean, essentially, instead of just having like random, ex-Green Berets that were recruited from Soldier of Fortune magazine or something like that, you've got like a formal corporate structure that's actually, directing all of this. I mean, really an entity in and of itself that is well funded and is well organized, unlike what you would have seen in the 60s or 70s.
So let's talk a little bit. I want to talk about these private military contractors. And I guess we really could start historically with the British East India Company, because that really gives a template for what is going on now. But you could also, I guess, historically add in like something like the Paladin Group, which is direct. You talk about Nazis. I mean, Otto Skorzeny and the Paladin Group. But let's talk about a little bit kind of like this kind of like historical precedents and kind of move into what's going on with these PMCs.
Well, I mean, you could go back even further than the British East India Company to, the mercenary companies that, prevailed really throughout the late Middle Ages, going into kind of the Renaissance period and what have you. Of course, Machiavelli famously had the treatise on something of whether you should use mercenaries or, conscript soldiers and that type of thing. So, I mean, the use of mercenaries was really very common until the early 17th century, which was really when the Westphalian, I believe it would be considered, state began to emerge, the modern nation state, and that really tipped the balance of power towards national armies, at least within Europe itself. But as you kind of alluded to, you also had these large trade companies and what have you that began to spring up afterwards, and they were a great way for the European powers to exercise their influence in the New World, in Asia, and that type of thing, but obviously without, specifically committing their flag to it. So, I mean, you had these mercenary armies that could carry out the objectives of the Dutch or the British or something like that without directly involving these nations, which became, very useful in the scramble for India, because, I mean, it certainly wasn't just the British who were trying to get in on the action. There were other powers at play, but it didn't break into a world war, I should say, or kind of an early world war, because they were private armies basically duking it out, and not the official governments. But a lot of this stuff went away by the 19th century, in no small part due to just the horrendous company rule that had prevailed in India. In theory, that should have improved things, though that's obviously debatable. But the use of mercenaries had become increasingly taboo, and really when we got into the early Cold Wars, I'd alluded to, it was really done in a kind of an informal fashion. The CIA's always used mercenaries heavily, but you would use something like Soldier of Fortune magazine to recruit these guys, and it was a very it was an informal network, to put it mildly. Yeah. But the change really came with the British in the mid-'60s, and this is at the time really in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis. The empire is evaporating, the Americans are refusing to step in and help them. So they're driven out of Egypt. They had put a lot of their fleet and what have you in Yemen. That was a major port. I think it was in Adena or something like that. And now Nasser starts to move in there. He's pushing the British once again. Are they going to just be totally driven into the Mediterranean? Certainly that was on everybody's minds. Well, fortunately for the British, they had Julian Amory and his merry band of Scotsmen, mostly revolving around Clan Fraser of Lovat. He came up with a rather, brilliant ideal, at least in a sense, to preserve the British Empire. And that was basically to take these, these SAS guys, use them as mercenaries for the Yemen government, the royalist faction there, supply them with arms, and kind of another major innovation was to get Saudi Arabia basically to pay for all of it. And now you had just an operation totally going on there to preserve British influence that had absolutely no direct tie really to the British government at all. The guy that Amory got to oversee all of this was David Sterling, Colonel David Sterling, who was one of the co-founders of the SAS. And it was extremely successful, for better or worse. They were able to completely bog down Nasser's forces and I believe inflict something like 15,000 casualties on his army, which is tremendous for just, the size of Egypt's army in that time frame. And it was probably just instrumental to them being destroyed by the Israelis in the 7-Day War a couple of years later. But it was just brutal, the guerrilla warfare that he plunged the nation into, and it just absolutely bled Nasser dry, and really led to the decline of Egypt as an influence in that region of the world, where it had been very significant in the 50s and 60s. It just really went into a decline that's never been reversed beginning into the 70s. And so anyway, this was really successful. Sterling saw a great way to make money, so he founded what was known as Watchguard International, which was what's generally considered to be the first modern private military company. And this was actually the model that Scherzini had used when he had set up the Paladin Group. In fact, I believe he had even listed Watchguard International as being the British, division of it, or something to that effect. And that's actually it's kind of incredible because, Scherzini had been, basically hired by Nasser to train his security forces, and he had brought in all of these Nazis and what have you there to help with that. And, of course, had been opposed to the British in that region of the world. And then suddenly he's turning around and working with David Sterling. But that was about par of the course with Scarface. He loved to play both sides against each other. But yeah, I mean, so Sterling sets up all of this, and it certainly kind of turned into a garden industry in the UK in the 70s, with Control List Limited. That spawned Keeny Meany and some of these other firms. Sterling himself got back into the racket in the 1980s with KAS International. And this really became a significant way for the British to continue their influence in the world without, really involving the UK directly, and in many cases without even having to pay for anything. And this just really reached, a pinnacle in a sense during the 90s after the Cold War had ended in Africa, where, you almost see these kind of mini East India companies being established. Of course, the big player in all this was Tony Buckingham, who was a former Special Boat Service veteran. He, along with an SAS veteran called Simon Mann, who had also been in Sterling's CAS International, set up Executive Outcomes, the infamous mercenary firm that had inspired the Leonardo DiCaprio movie Blood Diamond. Most of the troops in Executive Outcomes were South Africans from the famous 32nd Battalion, but the owners were mostly British. And, in addition to owning Executive Outcomes, Buckingham owned, I think it was Heritage Oil or something like that. He owned a bunch of diamond consortiums and just essentially lots of companies that were involved in natural resources. And, he would go into a country like Angola that had oil and different rebel factions that were at each other's throats after the Soviet and U.S. had started to withdraw their, influence from these particular regions of the world. He'd find one of the groups that he thought he could work with. He'd ask them to sell him oil rights or something like that. They'd say, well, yeah, we'd love to do that, Tony, but unfortunately, we don't control that part of the country. That's, the other rebel group that's got it. And Tony would say, that's not a big deal, you can just sign me the mineral rights or the oil rights over, and, I'll lend you the money, and then you can turn around and hire my mercenaries. They'll go in and destroy your rivals over there. And then, we can all start sharing in the bounty of the oil money while, the rest of your country starves. And, I'll leave you some mercenaries to protect your interests too, just because I'm a nice guy.
This was like just another form of neo-colonialism.
Yes,
essentially.
Essentially, yeah. And I mean, you can still see successors to the Executive Outcomes there to this day with Saracen and some of these other companies, which ironically Eric Prince eventually became involved with. So, we definitely, I think, learned a couple of things from the British and the intern in that regard.
Well, and you talk about how a lot of these guys from South Africa, it was similar to what happened in Germany and other repressive regimes. Once the regime falls, all these guys just become mercenaries for hire, and so you have this exodus of all these former elite special operations types who just went all over Africa and all the ensuing chaos over these last 3-4 decades.
Oh yeah, and I mean, well, especially with the 32nd Battalion, which was, like I said, mainly where Executive Outcome drew from the ranks of. I mean, these guys were pretty much like full-blown super soldiers. They were. There was during the 80s, around 86 or so, the Cubans had sent a large military contingent to Angola to fight the South African forces that had been deployed there. So the Cubans had put together a large fighting force. I think it was a couple of brigades along with their, Angolan supporters and what have you. It was almost 20,000 troops, I think they had mustered, that they were going to use to try to drive the South Africans finally out of the country. And South Africa, all they sent to counter this force was the 32nd Battalion. It was only around, like 1,000 men or something like that. So, I mean, they were literally outnumbered almost 20-1 at some sections of the battle, and they just, they annihilated the Cubans, basically. I think the Cubans tried to claim that it was a victory because the 32nd Battalion didn't manage to completely destroy their forces. They might as well, because I think this was the battle, too, where they had essentially sent prostitutes that were, that had contracted AIDS to the Cuban soldiers and got them infected, too. So, yeah, I mean, Cuba actually had almost no cases of AIDS before that, and then all of the soldiers got infected in this battle, and they've never really even talked about it. From what I understand, it really decimated Cuba's military. It's never really recovered from that. So, yeah, I mean, the 32nd Battalion essentially managed to do what the CIA and the U.S., all the money we threw at Castro for years didn't manage to do, and that was destroy his military. So yeah, I mean, these guys were just, as elite could come. And yeah, I mean, it's just like, well, what do you do when this regime collapses with these kinds of soldiers? This just, you've created kind of a monster, really, a Frankensteinian monster. And, there's almost no way to stop it in the aftermath. I mean, people are going to want these services.
Yeah, I mean, you're basically saying that same strategy of tension was being applied all throughout Africa to gain resources for these conglomerates.
Yeah, I mean, essentially in the post-Cold War years, it was definitely a bit of a struggle there. And then, I mean, later on, of course, in Angola, you kind of see it playing out between the U.S. and the U.K., where, I mean, we're backing one rebel faction, the British are backing another one. So, I mean, it really was almost a kind of neo-scramble for Africa, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this time period, you really witness the growth of these private military contractors, and leading up to the global war on terror, which then, especially for the United States, they play a pivotal role in it, and that is what has set the standard for the role that they have now and their increasing power. So can you kind of give a background to how we got to that, and what the global war on terror did for these private companies, and how they really seems like you're saying that they have the inheritance of this Cold War underground world is really alive today in them?
Yeah, in many ways. Well, I mean, of course, the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, and that led to a massive, just in general cutback in defense spending and that type of thing. And specifically with the CIA, I mean, it had already been shrinking its paramilitary forces, which are in, I think the Special Activities Division or something to that effect. And I think maybe even within, they've got like the Special Operations Group or something, which was the, actual fighters. But anyway, they just don't have the numbers for this kind of stuff that they did during the Cold War. And then when the global war on terror breaks out, the CIA really had no choice but to lean much more heavily on these PMCs for forces for this. Like I kind of alluded to before, they had always used Green Berets, ex-Green Berets and what have you in a mercenary capacity. But typically this was for covert operations, stuff that you didn't want the public to know about. Whereas, I mean, now you're starting to use mercenary forces in direct avert roles in Afghanistan and Iraq and cases, because there's just really nobody else that you can turn to, essentially. Yeah, I mean, just the general lack of resources in that capacity, and these companies were able, and of course, that was kind of, I think, what the ideal had already been. You laid off all of these these paramilitary figures at the aftermath of the Cold War, and they all start setting up these companies and what have you, because it was probably aware at some point there was going to be a need for these services. Right. Certainly the American empire is not going to just end with the end of the Cold War, obviously. So yeah, and then really the global war on terror provided a pretext for all of this to go into motion, to make the these companies, which had been fairly marginal in the 90s, and to just behemoths going into the 21st century.
Who are some of the characters, or what are some of the connections that connect that Cold War underground world to these modern PMCs? Some of the figures, and like Prince, I guess, is the main one. But who are some of the in-between connections, and how do these companies really actually tie back into that world?
Well, I mean, in the British angle, you can see it a lot more clearly when you look at a guy like David Sterling, who had set up KAS Right. International, and then from there it kind of goes into guys like Simon Mann and Tony Buckingham, and then from there into guys like Tim Spicer, who was the guy who had set up first Sandline International, and then Aegis. which had really become the most significant private military company operating in Iraq at the height of the conflict there. In fact, they were the company that was basically hired to coordinate all of the other private military companies in the entire conflict, essentially. And I know one of Spicer's, gosh, I can't remember the guy's name now off the top of my head, but one of the guys who had helped him procure the contract had been a veteran of the French Foreign Legion, going back to the late 50s, early 60s. And the Legion was another popular destination for former SS men in the aftermath of the Second World War, because historically, the French Foreign Legion it's attracted a lot of disreputable types over the years. Of course, for many, many years, pretty much anybody, regardless of whether you were a convicted murderer or something like that, could go into the French Foreign Legion. You could get a new identity. And then when you got out, you were basically in the free and clear. So yes, in the aftermath of the Second World War, a lot of SS men found this to be very appealing, so that if for no other reason, they would avoid charges of war crimes. And the French, their military forces were utterly decimated, so they were willing to look the other way to bring in a couple of SS men, well, actually a lot of SS men, into the legions. But anyway, this guy had, he was inactive in the French Foreign Legion with these former Nazis. He got to know all of these OAS guys, the secret army organization, who had revolted against de Gaulle in the early 60s. So, just this one individual alone, whose name escapes me, was tied into this just whole kind of black underground. He ends up, lobbying for Spicer, who was in many ways another creation of this kind of Cold War nexus as well, to basically be the guy who takes over overseeing the private military industry in Iraq. And then, this is all kind of unfolding against the backdrop of Spicer meeting with Le Cow in, I believe it was 2003 or something like that. This is another just pinnacle Cold War anti-communist organization that had rechristened itself in the global war on terror. Spicer meets with these guys, and about a year later, he's given this enormous contract by the U.S. government to manage the private military industry in Iraq. So, it's definitely, in a very real sense, a continuation of these covert politics that had their origins in the Cold War.
Well, yeah, it seems like I was telling Adam earlier, as far as the connections between the modern day and these characters, it's definitely enough that like a local cop in an anti-gang task force would be able to round people up as associated. It's like it's just wild. It seems like there is a unbroken chain to this world and our current world. And are some of these ideologues now that we have too, do they feel like they're a part of this chain, and that they're inheriting this, like an ideologue like a Steve Bannon or something? If you get inspiration,
or Eric Prince or Betsy DeVos, or any of them, yeah.
Well, in a lot of ways, I think a guy like Prince actually sees himself as, at the forefront of really a new ruling class, or at least a new ruling elite within the national security state. Of course, that's something else that I really got into in the book, was just how much Rumsfeld had really affected a true revolution in the national security state as the Secretary of Defense. And, that really went into just the whole nature of covert operations. Pretty much throughout the Cold War and up through the 90s, the CIA had just a total monopoly on covert operations. The military was involved, but again, in a support role. They provided the grunts to actually go out and do the fighting, but the CIA oversaw everything ultimately. But under Rumsfeld, you really saw the rise of the Joint Special Operations Command, which is essentially the governing body for the elite counterinsurgency and counterterrorist forces in the U.S. military. This is your Delta Force, your SEAL Team 6, the Night Stalkers, and occasionally the Army Rangers and some of the other elite groups. But, now suddenly JSOC is basically directing covert operations by itself, without the CIA having any real involvement. And I mean, they already had a very elite intelligence unit detached to it, which was called the Activity, but now they started getting, on the ground, spooks, human resources, that type of thing. And it became almost one-stop shopping in a very real sense. I mean, it's almost carrying out the, what historically would have been the dominion of the Directorate of Plans in the CIA. And you can see just, the profound influences it's had in places like Yemen or Somalia now, where for years, JSOC has pretty much been fighting a war, almost single-handedly in these countries against the various, guerrilla forces there and what have you. I mean, it has the paramilitary operators, the intelligence assets, and even in a lot of cases, the war officers to carry out all of this without any real involvement from the CIA at all. And that really, I think, has led to a tremendous loss of power from the CIA in the 21st century within the, the national security state.
Yeah, so it's basically, in a sense, that what they want to do is privatize national security.
Yeah, well, I mean,
going further from like a mercenary army to just privatizing all of our national security and not being in other words, there's no national interest.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that that's, kind of what we're heading towards with, Eric Prince, asking to be with the viceroy or something like that of Afghanistan. And, yeah, I mean, now it's like instead of just, the CIA or even JSOC hiring Blackwater or something like that to carry out operations in, Afghanistan, it's like, we're not even going to have that, degree of government involvement. We're just going to hire, Frontier Services Limited, and they're just going to run, our, everything in Afghanistan for us, basically. Yeah, I mean, it's really incredible. And yeah, it just sort of, I think it's just kind of like, I was kind of getting to earlier, you can see going into the global war on terror. I mean, Rumsfeld essentially felt that the CIA had gone soft, and of course it didn't even have the paramilitary capability to do what he wanted it to in the first place. It had to get them PMCs to do that. JSOC, takes over doing this, and in the process, it grooms just, hosts and hosts of potential recruits for these private military companies, especially after now almost 2 decades of, using JSOC heavily in heavy combat in the Middle East. And now, you've got ample recruits. These companies are just loaded with money. They've formed a bizarre alliance with, venture capitalists and all this other stuff. Now, I mean, yeah, you could argue that, we've even moved beyond JSOC. We're ready to just take everything full-blown private.
Right. There seems to be, in a way, and I think that you kind of cover this in the book, that there's almost like a kind of a new kind of medievalism or new kind of feudalism that's going on here, where you have basically now everything is like in the private interest. What is the end game here with this?
I mean, increasingly, it just looks like a lot of the kind of time-honored conspiracy theories, if you will, about like the UN one world government and what have you were, I mean, a kind of head fake, if you will. I mean, you really could kind of see almost the apex of that going back to, 1991. The European Union emerges. You've still got the Soviet Union kind of going on, and then you've got the United States. I mean, already you're sort of seeing the world being organized into these transnational bodies and so on and so forth.
Right.
You've got a UN peacekeeping force effectively being deployed to Iraq or, ancient Babylon, if you will. And then just everything kind of starts to fall apart. The Soviet Union falls apart. It splits into dozens of new states or, states now reemerging with independence and so forth. Going into the 21st century, the EU starts to collapse. The UK's left. I mean, I definitely think there's a strong chance that the continental European Union will not survive this whole COVID thing. And it seems like with the ratcheting up of tensions against China, there's I think there's a very real possibility that one of our major objectives behind all of this is to get China to break up. So, I kind of think the end game ultimately, and it might well even, go into the United States itself as well with, breaking up the union here too. But I think the end game is ultimately to reduce a lot of the world into these nation states that are essentially inferior to multinational corporations.
Right.
They just don't have the resources in terms of financially, to compete with a lot of the multinationals. And if you harness them to these private military companies, they're not going to have the security forces to counter them either.
And the companies don't have to capture a nation state.
No, I mean, they just, they just need to be contracted by it, essentially, and you've got your influence in there. Yeah. So, I mean, it's really, incredible what we're witnessing now with all of this. It really is a kind of neo-medievalism or neo-feudalism, if you will, that I think is what we're starting to emerge in the 21st century.
Yeah, very much so. How is this like today, now, at this moment? Because, I wanted to kind of ask you, get your thoughts on this. I mean, what we're seeing right now with the coronavirus and all this and the response to it has been essentially almost like, okay, the states are going to take care of this. The federal government's not gonna do some things, but the states have got to do some other things. We're in a situation here in Tennessee where basically, the governor has talked about, hey, we're going to open up the state at the end of this month in April, but the 4 largest cities are going to say, well, we're going to take our own pace. So there seems to be like this really decentralization going on, and it seems when I read this book, that I'm almost just like, that this seems to be like, this is like almost part of the plan, almost, is to like to kind of like decentralize. And what do you think do you think that there is something to that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think so. And then, of course, I mean, on top of that, I mean, you kind of see Trump tweeting out these, was it open up, Virginia, or was it liberate Virginia or whatever? Yeah. I mean, on top of all that, I mean, it definitely seems like he's pushing his followers, towards this direction. And I mean, that gets into some really, murky stuff, because I mean, certainly, Europe wasn't the only part of the world that had these stay behind networks. Certainly, they did exist here and do still exist, and a lot of them really were comprised of these militia groups and what have you. And you see this kind of continuing to this day with organizations like the Oath Keepers. And, what is the composition of this group? Well, it's almost entirely of former military men and police officers. So, yeah, you've basically got, these kind of private militias and this type of thing that, you can further whip into a frenzy to cause destabilization in these areas. And, if we're kind of following the trajectory that Katrina established, when the security forces, the local police and whatever, you become overwhelmed, well, who's going to be called in to handle this? Well, probably a PMC, most likely. I mean, that was what we saw happen in Katrina over a decade ago. And with how things have advanced, since then, I think you could see it on a much larger scale now. I mean, it's rather Machiavellian in a lot of ways. I mean, you kind of use these these neo-fascist, militia type groups, which ironically, I mean, the coordinating body for all this is a group that we talked about in the last episode, the Sovereign Order of St. John. I know Dr. Future's written a lot about the current Protestant incarnation of that. One of the big guys involved with it is General William Jerry Boykin. He was the former head of Joint Special Operations Command. I'm sure he probably knows a lot of these these guys and tied up in the PMCs and all this racket. Of course, he was a big Trump supporter. I'm guessing in this context, he probably got to know Eric Prince. I'm pretty sure he does know Keith Kellogg, who's another big, General Keith Kellogg, who's another big Trump backer. He's been a big part of Trump's national security team since the beginning. So, you got Jerry Boykin over here, who's kind of organizing the Christian right into all these militias and what have you. You call on these guys to cause up a little trouble, and then you turn around and get some of Boykin's buddies like Eric Prince potentially, or Keith Kellogg, and some of their Michael Flynn, some of these guys to start launching their or bring in their own private security companies to help quell the disturbances that Boykin's buddies have been putting up. So yeah, it's going to be pretty incredible, I think, what we're going to see in the coming months, unfortunately.
Wow. Yeah. That's
Yikes.
it just really mirrored to me what I was reading to what I'm seeing in the news. And it just kind of it starts to make sense when you put it in the context of these mercenary private military company groups trying to really essentially take over. So has that been something that within the Trump administration that has been the huge push? That's really the big struggle right now when Trump talks about the deep state. What he's really doing is just giving it over to another kind of deep state entity, essentially.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it's nonsense to argue that Trump is, at war with the deep state. I mean, he's a part of the bloody deep state. I mean, he was the CEO of Resorts International, for pity's sake. I mean, I've written about this in my blog, but I mean, it was a gaming company that was just mobbed up to the gills. And on top of that, it had its own private intelligence company, Intertel, which was staffed heavily by, NSA and CIA and military and FBI intelligence veterans. So Trump did not, become the CEO of this entity by being an outsider.
Right.
He's basically just, like I kind of alluded to before, I think he is not at war with the deep state, but he's at war with an aging version of the deep state, and he is receiving support from an emerging faction, the faction kind of oriented around these private military companies and so forth.
And would you see that some of his foreign policy, the less, the focus on pulling back from some of these foreign entanglements aren't necessarily a true isolationism or not wanting to be involved in these things, but is more of giving these places over to the private military contractors?
Yeah, I mean, I think very much so. I think, and I mean, it just kind of goes, I think, in general with, what Trump was kind of put in there to do. And in my opinion, there were two fundamental objectives of the Trump presidency. One was to dismantle the Bretton Woods system that's, essentially defined the global economic order since the end of World War II, which he's doing with these tariffs and things like that. And then to also reorient American foreign policy towards containment of China. I mean, really, for the last, 3 decades or so, really since the end of the Cold War, most of our national or, foreign policy initiatives have been centered in the global South and securing resources in these impoverished third world countries and what have you. And like you're kind of saying, I think that, going forward is going to be turned over to these private military companies. They're going to do the work, that kind of work for us so that we can put, the bulk of our official forces in the Pentagon and so forth in a direction towards China and thus, free them up for this, ultimate containment of China.
It's enough to make your head spin.
Yeah.
on all this. But yeah, once you put it in the proper context, I think it all makes sense.
No, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's the most compelling explanation I've found thus far. Certainly a little, I think, more compelling than a world government over the World Health Organization anyway.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit in the time what we have left. I want to talk a little bit about kind of like the occult roots of some of this, and especially Julius Evola.
Who's really had a kind of resurgence with a lot of what we would call the alt-right and even people from the Trump administration.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, also going into Russia too with Dugin and what have you as well. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, well, Evola was probably one of the two big influences on the doctrine of the strategy of tension, along with, the French concept of the guerre révolutionnaire. But, Evola, I mean, when you look at a lot of the prominent, neo-fascist terrorists, I mean, almost all of them were followers of Julius Evola at one time or other. I mean, certainly some of them broke after a time frame, but at some point they had almost all respected his philosophy. And then, of course, you had the major kind of neo-fascist organization, the New Order. The guy who headed that was just a fanatical supporter of Julius Evola, and this was really the principal militant organization that had been used for the Gladio-type terrorism in Italy for many years. I mean, the guys that were following him were especially militant, and when you kind of got into this this neo-fascist dysphoria, I mean, certainly I think his ideology got spread even further going into the global south. Of course, in Chile, you had, what was his name? Soriano, I believe, Miguel Soriano, if I'm not mistaken, who, prominent Chilean occultist who was also a big supporter of Jewish Evoli there and what have you. And then just in general, you know, with the Landig group in Austria, and the head of this, William Landig, you know, he was tied into all this with the World Anti-Communist League. He was a representative for WACL in Austria. But Landig was the guy who had really spread the notion of the Black Sun and the Lost Battalion and all these other staples that have become so big in, you know, esoteric Nazism and what have you in the late 20th and early 21st century. And Landig was a big follower of Evoli. And ironically, both of them were actually based out of Salzburg in the waning days of the Second World War. So it would not be surprising if they had known one another, and there might have been something deliberate about what Landig was trying to spread. Of course, you know, Evoli's ideology was very much an elite ideology. It was only intended for an initiated elite, but Landig was able to come up with something that was more populist, that, I mean, could, you know, reach the common masses, the great unwashed masses, probably in the perspective of Evoli. But you know, what he was doing was almost akin to what Gardner had been doing with Wicca in terms of Thelema or something to that effect. Though certainly Crowley had always intended Thelema to be much more of a popular ideology than Evoli had really intended for his own system, certainly.
Right. Can you give just a kind of a background for people who may not be familiar with who Evola was and what his official capacities were for the Third Reich at the end of the war?
Well, he was an Italian. Obviously, he was a prominent occultist and also a philosopher. He had really cut his mystical teeth at the Group during the 1920s. And they were, of course, quite obsessed with Mithricism and so forth. Of course, Evola really, a lot of his system was based on the caste system of the Hindus, but in his cosmology, the Brahmin caste, the priest caste, was subservient to the warrior caste. In his kind of idealized form of government, if you will, essentially society would have been governed by, you know, an initiated warrior monk type setup. I mean, almost a kind of Jedi order, if you will, though certainly I suppose from most people's perspective they would have been more of a Sith order, but something along those lines. Effectively, during the, you know, he had of course flirted with Nazism and fascism, though he had ended up becoming a critic of both ideologies, and that was essentially because he thought that Hitler and Mussolini didn't go far enough with it. There was too much pandering to the trade unions and Christianity and that type of thing. But it had been a noble ideal that had been perverted by populism or something to that effect. Nonetheless, though, they never moved against Evola, no matter how much he criticized either regime. And by war's end, he had been brought into the SD, which was the principal intelligence service for the SS. And there's a lot of mystery as to what exactly he was doing at the end of the war. Evola himself claimed that he was essentially working on a history of secret societies, which just does not make, you know, any sense when you've literally got the Red Army encircling Germany to just, you know, put the resources for this guy to write a book at this point in time. The great Kevin Coogan, who sadly is no longer with us anymore, had suggested that he was essentially being used to found a new kind of pan-European ideology that could be used to support Nazism in the post-war years. You know, certainly I think that's a compelling argument, and you know, I think there's a possibility that was what Landig was trying to do. Of course, as I had alluded to before, Landig, who, and he was also in the SD as well, but in the inland version of the SD, which was it was the one that essentially handled domestic affairs. Evola was probably in the foreign one, but you know, both of these guys are stationed at Salzburg at the end of the war. Landig did so much to bring Evola's ideology to kind of a popular conception of it that the, you know, masses could consume. So, you know, you have to kind of wonder, was he paying out what Coogan had suggested, that he was basically crafting a post-war fascist ideology that would be more inclusive to Europeans on the whole, instead of just, emphasizing Germanness. I think there's a great possibility of that, and that Landig had been used to, essentially craft a popular conception of this. While Evola, he continued to inspire elites, which he's still doing with people like Dugan and Bannon and all these other wonderful people.
Well, I mean, this I got to tell you, Stephen, this has been fascinating. I mean, there's so much that we have covered in this, and
Yeah.
there's like so much that is left in this book.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the book is a wild ride, and there's so many connections and so many things that will make your head spin, but you do a really good job of keeping everything together. Can you tell people where they can find the book, and also find your blog, and also possibly get in touch with you if they need to?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, you can always get in touch with me with my blog under the contact thing there. But the blog is VisupView. That's VisupView.blogspot.com. You can get the book Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, Post-War Nazis, Mercenaries, and Other Secret History at Amazon. And you can also get the PDF version from my website, and also at the official store for my podcast. The link or the address for that is The Farm Podcast. That's all one word, The Farm Podcast .store /. And you can get the PDF version there. And right now we actually have a pandemic special, if you will, going on, where you get both Strange Tales of the Parapolitical and Contact Them or Us, which was the prior book written by my co-author with this, Frank Zero, and our good friend Jeremy Knight, who's also a part of the collective. Jeremy's a great guy. He does a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff for us, but certainly the cost of these two books in the PDF is cheaper than a physical copy would be. And selfishly, we also don't have to split the proceeds with Amazon, so that's very nice as well. So yeah, definitely think about that. And you can also find a link to get the PDF at my website as well. And if you're not sick of hearing me talk by the end of this interview, you can also check out my podcast. That is the Farm Podcast.com. Like I said, that's all one word. So yeah, definitely check us out. We cover parapolitics, synchromysticism, all kinds of other crazy stuff. We got people like Jason Horsley, Alan Greenfield, Chris Knowles, and what have you appearing. So yeah, if you like what you've heard here, definitely check us out there. And of course the blog, and yeah, consider picking up a copy of the book as well.
Did you have fun with Greenfield?
Yes, I did. I'm definitely looking forward to having him back at some point. But good Lord, that man does love to hear himself talk. No, I mean, he is an interesting guy. So, it works. It wouldn't necessarily work for everybody, but it does work with Alan. He is a great guy, so, and he's definitely got some very interesting stories, but a lot of them, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, he's great. We just did a 2-parter with him not that long ago. All right. Thank you so much, Stephen. Recluse. Stay on the line for us. We're going to close out this section. And guys, we will be back to close out the show on Conspirinormal. I want to leave some of that in.
Yeah, I'll edit it appropriately.
Yeah. But it's like, that was a good episode, man. I was really, really impressed by it. What were some of your thoughts on that? We'll just go straight into there doing our outro.
Yeah, we've been following his blog for a long time. So, and we, had him on 2 years ago. When we were talking about the Knights of Malta stuff that was happening in tandem with Dr. Future's research. So that was really cool. And I just started following his blog. I haven't been as up to date with it as I like to be, but if you've been following his blog, just the way he has summarized, so much of what he's been blogging about into this book it's almost like an encyclopedia, of post World War II, of the underbelly of the Cold War. And like I was telling him, all the stuff is in the popular consciousness about Paperclip and the rocket program and Nazis hiding out in South America. But when you put that many people together in one place and show their relationships, it's crazy, man. It just really makes you think.
Yeah, it does indeed.
What's the lasting impact? And what's the lasting impact of everything that happened in the Cold War and these people we are friends with gonna be for the future?
Yeah. Right. There's just, like you said, there's this long line that you could like take directly from the Nazis, the fascists, and just bring it down to today through some of these groups. And then you've even got, you could say, okay, that these private military companies are like fascists or whatever they are, but also at the same time, they kind of hark back to things that are even further back than that, because as we were talking about with Recluse, that there's this kind of a certain kind of almost that's going on. And, I guess maybe that is harkening back to some kind of sort of fascism in and of itself. But one interesting thing that I had studied before I read this book was Otto Skorzeny and the Paladin Group. And that's something that I really did not know about a lot till I started really looking into it. And Paladin Group was an interesting group, and they were very much one of these private military companies or private intelligence companies, in the sense that basically here you had this like hardcore Nazi, right? This Skorzeny was responsible for when Mussolini was kicked out of power, he was in prison. Skorzeny, brought him out of prison.
True believers, not just scientists.
Commando raid, and then also in the Battle of the Bulge, he would have SS guys dress up like American soldiers to cause havoc behind the lines, speaking English and American accents, that kind of stuff. But the Paladin Group after the war was something that he started, I think, about probably in like the 50s or 60s, and they were mostly based in Franco's Spain, which was very sympathetic to like a lot of the fascist cause. And
she talks about a lot of these launching pads, like you had these safe zones for all these people to congregate to plan for all their activities across the world. First, I guess you had Franco's Spain, and then Chile really became the next place.
Portugal would have been another place too that had this kind of weird kind of quasi-fascist government. Even before Chile, you would have had Peron and Argentina. That was very sympathetic, and Argentina had so much sympathy for the Nazi cause. Brazil, to a certain extent, we talked a little bit about that with Tom back in our last Tom and Ginny episode. But the one thing that's interesting about the Paladin Group was that they basically sold themselves off for the highest bidder, because you had one of the splinter groups of the Palestinian Liberation Organization were actually a communist organization. Mm-hmm. And they actually hired Skorzeny's group for some things. So here's Skorzeny, supposedly rabid anti-communist, right? Nazi. And he's working for this communist Palestinian group. And even more controversial than that is the reports that the Mossad actually hired Skorzeny to kill these German rocket scientists that were working for Nasser in Egypt. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, talk about the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I mean, that's crazy to even think about, even consider. But that's something that, of course, the Mossad denies that, but there are there is some proof that actually did happen. So yeah, that's one that we got a lot of these different influences in the world, man. And I mean, that's one thing that I talk about a lot when, like, you know, people say, well, there's this overarching conspiracy and there's this, you know, it's the Illuminati or the Jesuits or whatever that are, you know, this one monolithic, or the communists is one monolithic thing. It's not like that. It's more like these different groups that are kind of competing together, and you've got several of them. So that's one of the things I'd like to go back to a lot, to try to understand this stuff and to really get your head around what is actually going on, instead of kind of more these simplistic kind of views or these simplistic kind of viewpoints. Is there anything that you kind of wanted to add to that?
No, I think you hit it on the head, man. I mean, we're just, I really recommend this book if you want kind of a big picture and a who's who. And like I said, it's like an encyclopedia of the people and organizations. And, you know, I'd like to see like a visual model that just you could look at to connect all these people together, because it's definitely a web.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
It has connections to people in power this day.
Well, guys, thank you so much for listening. If you want to help us out, Sergio can tell you where to go. Put him on the spot.
You can make a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com, or you can go to patreon.com/Conspirinormal and become a patron. We did a patron segment for this one as well about the UFO connection to all this crazy stuff we're talking about. And we got content on there every week. You can get in for as little as $1. So patreon.com/Conspirinormal.
Absolutely, guys. Don't forget that really helps us out. We know these are tough times, but if you can spare $1, help us out. Here's some extra content going all the way back to 2016. And don't forget about the YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast. That helps us out with subscriptions to that as well. So, all right. We will be back next time, guys, on another fun-filled episode of Conspirinormal.
Please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal, or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.